On the front pages of tomorrow's newspapers with Sohrab Ahmari, a writer at the Wall Street Journal, and the historian and author Dr. Eliza Filby. And let's just give you an idea of some of the things we're looking at. Here's the front of the Daily Mail saying that 1 in 4 young adults are still living at home. That and lots of others coming up. You're watching Sky News. In just a moment, we've got the press preview for you. Our first look at what's on the front pages as they arrive. First, though, a reminder of our top stories here this evening. The Conservative backbench MP, Stephen Phillips, has quit Parliament over the government's policy towards Brexit. Intelligence officials have warned that Al-Qaeda could be planning terror attacks in several states around the US presidential election. And a former police superintendent from Wales has been jailed for 12 years for sexually assaulting underage boys in the 1980s. Hello there, you're watching the press preview. Our first look at what's on the front pages as they arrive. Over the next half hour, we'll see what's making the headlines with Sohrab Ahmari, a writer at the Wall Street Journal, and the historian and author Dr. Eliza Filby. So very good evening to both of you.
Good evening. So
let's take a check on what's on those front pages then. And the I newspaper says Europe has told Theresa May to get on with Brexit, saying that any delay to triggering Article 50 will harm the chance of a good deal. The Daily Express says the Prime Minister has pledged that there will be no delay on leaving the EU, with 99% of its readers claiming to have been betrayed by the ruling. The Telegraph says ministers are preparing for a general election in the early spring of next year, brought on by the Brexit court decision and the resignation of a Tory MP. The Times says that Theresa May has been told to stop government ministers making offensive attacks on the judges who made the Brexit ruling. The paper says she's been warned that the criticism is threatening the independence of the judiciary. The Guardian also says the Prime Minister has been told to calm the mob anger and says Mrs May stands accused of failing to prevent a furious backlash against the judgment. The FT, meanwhile, says the pound has rebounded after the Brexit ruling to the welcome relief of investors. And on other stories, the Mail says that 1 in 4 adults in their 20s and early 30s are still living at home with their parents because of the high house prices and the cost of renting. The Daily Mirror leads on the distressing news for Michael Bublé that his 3-year-old son Noah has cancer and that he's asked for his fans to pray for him. The Sun also leads on that story, saying the singer has put his career on hold to devote all his time to getting Noah well. Meanwhile, the Daily Star says that we're set to shiver during our fireworks tomorrow night with freezing temperatures and even snow in some places. So let's chat through those front pages and some of the stories inside as well with Sohrab Ahmari and Dr. Eliza Filby. So welcome properly to both of you. And you work for the Washington Post, Sohrab, so let's take a look at the American elections, shall we? In fact, it hasn't made a lot of the front pages, but we have got Hillary Clinton there on the front, looking pretty determined, but in the face of those polls having narrowed in the last week.
Yeah, well, I think that it was pretty expected that as it always happens, as the election day nears, it'll tighten. But I'm still, as someone who's been very public in terms of predicting that Hillary Clinton will win, I'm starting to get a little nervous.
Your voice went slightly high and wobbly then when you said that.
Yeah, because I have a bet with a friend that I'd eat a shoe, if Trump wins.
Is that the only reason you're nervous?
Yeah, among them. And I think it's for a number of reasons. One of them is that she's just a deeply flawed candidate in a year when populist feeling is on the rise, not just in the U.S. but worldwide. The Democrats have put forward someone who is seen as very elitist, very sort of sees herself as above the law, secretive, unethical. In this mood that's already thrown up Trump on the other side, she's a very flawed candidate, and it's all coming out with this FBI story. And he's been relatively disciplined in the past few months. He hasn't really said anything.
And even in the last 2 days...
He started making proper speeches and talking in fully constructed sentences, I've noticed.
Well, I was going to say, it's been noted that he's sticking to Watercue.
Well, I think Trump is a phenomenon, surely. I mean, in American electoral history, in that, you know, everyone thought the big revelation of that tape where he basically admitted to molesting women would be the final nail in the Trump coffin. But no, he managed to come back, and largely because of Hillary's own faults and the FBI bombshell that the investigation into her emails was going to be reopened. I think my suspicion is that Clinton will win it, and I think the idea that the battle will go to the wire is actually slightly exaggerated. I think newspapers like to talk up the election as the day sort of edges near, but 40% of Americans have already voted, of course, and I think that in the key states, and this is where the election actually matters, be it Florida, North Carolina or Ohio, the key people are the shy Hillary voters, the Republicans that are, you know, holding their nose and voting for Hillary, and the shy Trumpers who perhaps haven't in the polling admitted that they will be voting for Trump. And that's full of uncertainty, and no one really can predict it. And I think it's going to be obviously in those key states where those factors will really play out.
And turnout presumably is crucial. And when you do have two candidates that a lot of people have a problem with, are you going to encourage people to go to vote? Are there going to be a lot of people that think, do you know what, I can't decide between these two candidates, I'm not going to bother?
Well, that's where Trump has the biggest weakness, I think. It's that he hasn't invested in get-out-the-vote operations that are so crucial for Republicans. Actually, for both parties.
Ground operation at all
on his part. He's not invested anything. He's just relied on the Republican National Committee apparatus to do that for him, whereas the Democrats have a well-oiled machine, and they target by demographic, you know, suburban women in, you know, the suburbs of Columbus, Ohio, African Americans in Philadelphia, and so they have this very, very good operation as far as doing that. Yeah,
you know, they've had Michelle Obama, they've had Barack Obama this week, targeting people that Hillary actually can't speak to, be it millennials or, you know, African Americans or the Hispanic vote. So I think, you know, Hillary, it hasn't just been a Hillary operation, it's been a full sort of operation on the Democratic Party.
Okay, and obviously the Clinton camp angry with the FBI decision to talk about opening a new investigation, but also this call, according to the Daily Mail, for President Putin to butt out. So tell us a little bit more about this.
Yeah, well, it's pretty clear that some of the leaks that are happening, and this is not just the Daily Mail, it's the FBI and other law enforcement and intelligence agencies in the United States saying that that these are Russian intelligence-directed leaks and hacks at, for example, the Democratic National Committee, which leaks that suggested that the National Committee had actually rigged the game against Bernie Sanders. So, you know, the U.S., I think, is sending a fair warning that we can play at the game as well, and that we can also, you know, cyber attacks will be met with at least proportionate response, and I think rightly so, because, you know, we're not Moldova. That is the kind of thing that's how Putin behaves in the countries on the periphery of Russia. It's pretty shocking to see it happening against the U.S.
But I think what's interesting about this story is that up until now it's mostly been Democrats that have been claiming there's some kind of Russian interference, whereas this is a legitimate call from the White House to say, you know, almost legitimizing the claim. But I think the more interesting story is the one at the bottom, which says that 80% of Americans are disgusted by this election. Both of the candidates have the worst rating in terms of trustworthiness and in terms of likability than any other candidates in history. You know, most Americans feel deeply unnerved and uncomfortable and slightly ashamed. Do you feel ashamed to be American with the way that this presidential race has been played out and what it's said about America?
Have you ever seen a campaign like this before?
Nothing like this. Nothing. I mean, the extraordinary figure of Trump, who's this carnival barker, basically. It's this infomercial charlatan, becoming the leader of the party of Lincoln and Ronald Reagan, is astonishing, and I think really tragic. But as I said, Hillary also has her flaws. I don't think they're comparable. I think Trump is, frankly, I think he's a danger to the Republic. But they're both really deeply unpopular characters. I'm in that 80%, let me put it that way.
Okay, let's move on to matters closer to our home, maybe. Your home at the moment. And the ongoing disagreements over what kind of Brexit we should have. Meanwhile, the Eye is saying Europe is telling Theresa May to get on with it, but there's the prospect of a delay, isn't there, after yesterday's High Court ruling that said that Article 50 had to go via Parliament.
Yes, and the central story here is, and I think it's the correct one, is that Europe does actually want May to get on with it, does actually want the Article 50 to be triggered. And obviously the ruling yesterday somewhat delays that fact. We are now going to take the government's going to take the ruling to the Supreme Court. That will delay the decision until January. So
except Theresa May is confident that they'll stick to the timetable.
She seems very confident that she will be able to stick to the March date for the triggering of Article 50. But, you know, who knows? I mean, what's interesting is today she phoned Angela Merkel and Juncker to, confirm that the plans were still going to be adhered to. And both Europe and Britain, I think, does require stability on this front, and business even. The March date was at least a target, was at least an ambition. And yesterday's ruling has somewhat thrown that all into question. But then on the other hand, it's surely right and proper that Parliament has a legitimate say and input into the whole process of Brexit. And I think what needs to be sort of fleshed out is whether Parliament has a say in whether Article 50 is triggered, or a say in the negotiations before we even get to the negotiating table. And that's where the confusion and I think the problems will start to
some people
unravel.
Wouldn't agree with you anyway, and they feel that it's the Prime Minister's prerogative now to lead the negotiations. Parliament don't need to be consulted. They don't agree with what the judges... the decision that the judges made yesterday.
Well, look, I think this just goes to show that the Brexiteers hadn't really thought through what would happen, and perhaps they didn't even expect to win. And so now all of this, so for example, I think it's a very fair point to say that if the whole point of Brexit was to reassert Parliament's, I almost said Congress, Parliament's prerogative, then that Parliament should have a say in shaping Brexit, and it shouldn't just be the royal prerogative. But none of these questions were thought through, I think, by the Brexit camp.
The question is not in shaping Brexit. I think it's on this particular issue, because Brexit's going to take a long time. There's going to be lots of negotiations, machinations. The issue here now is, does Parliament have a say, and if so, how, in the actual triggering of Article 50? And that needs to happen for even the negotiations to take place.
Right, but Parliament can shape through setting out an agenda for what would it take to actually trigger Article 50. What should Brexit look like would sort of be worked out partly through that process.
I agree with you. The other problem, of course, is to what extent is it being pushed by Remainers or Ramonas, depending on your position, to thwart Brexit even happening. I mean, the real obstacle actually is not the House of Commons, getting it through the House of Commons, but actually the House of Lords. And, Nick Clegg, who's always historically, the Liberal Democrats have always historically been against the existence of the House of Lords, is now heralding the House of Lords as the bastion of our protector against Brexit actually happening.
And questions over whether at the very least amendments might be put forward to shape the kind of Brexit people want. We must take a break though. Lots more to talk about after the break, including the Daily Mail on the most common password we're all using. It's coming up.
Prize.
Welcome back. You're watching the Press Preview. With me tonight are Sohrab Ahmari, a writer at the Wall Street Journal, and historian and author Dr. Eliza Filby. And we're going to talk about Brexit a little bit more just to kick off this section, because here's a story inside The Times which talks about today's resignation. This was Stephen Phillips, who was a Brexiteer but apparently is uncomfortable with the way in which his party was pushing for a hard Brexit. He didn't seem very happy about the way that it was being dealt with.
Yes, so Stephen Phillips, who resigned today, it is said, because he felt the Conservative Party had become UKIP light. He was particularly concerned over their policy on child refugees and international aid, and obviously the sort of unwillingness to allow Parliament to discuss Brexit. Although there are some sort of other suggestions that he rather likes being a barrister. He's a part-time barrister at the moment, and he's earned already rather a lot of money this year being a barrister, and would like to do that full-time. So there are suggestions that he would actually just rather not be an MP. But, however, the key story, as this Times headline displays is the slimming majority. Theresa May has already lost or had resigned or quit 3 MPs since she became Prime Minister. David Cameron, not her fault, admittedly. Zach Goldsmith, obviously over Heathrow, and now we've got Stephen Phillips. And she's going to need that majority. So it's very important that the by-election, when it comes and when it happens, is again a resounding victory for the Conservative Party. There are suspicions that UKIP could, Suzanne Evans has already expressed an interest to stand for the seat, and it was a strong Leave area in the referendum. So, is the Conservative majority under threat? I suspect not, but again, it calls into question how the government is handling Brexit, and are they on top of? Are they on top of things, or are things, slightly coming apart at the seams?
And if Article 50 does have to have parliamentary approval, if the government loses its appeal against yesterday's decision, how vital do you think that majority might be? And does this all add up to more pressure to perhaps call a general election even?
I think the political story is big, right? I think the fact that she's not losing, but the majority is slimming is important, and it's going to matter in this issue over Article 50, Parliament's role in it. But I think, to me, the deeper sort of substantive question that's behind this is what kind of Brexit Britain will have. I think the promise of Brexit, and I was a Remainer to the extent that an American's opinion matters, but if it had a promise, it was the idea that Britain would become this free market, prosperous place that was open to the world and open to trade and unshackled from regulation from Brussels. I think what we're seeing is a kind of protectionist Britain emerging, which is that UKIP light vision, which is not about free markets. It's more about social protection and protection against the effects of free trade. So that promise of Brexit is eroding, I think, and that's a symptom of this.
OK, we've got a couple of stories in a couple of minutes. Just whiz through them. Front of the Daily Mail, 1 in 4 young adults still living at home. The age bracket they're saying is 20 to 34-year-olds. It's not new in a way, is it? It's rising cost of living, of buying houses or renting property.
Yes, and it's part of actually being what they call the millennial generation now. 1 in 4 still living at home. We are over-reliant on our parents to fund us, not through only our education, but also to support us in our childcare costs once we start having children. My generation, I don't know if you're a millennial, but are doing things later in life. We are having babies later. We are leaving home later. We are becoming financially independent later. And I think this is also a symptom of obviously higher and rising house prices, higher rents, particularly in the southeast and London area. And I think it's deeply worrying because the markers of adulthood are leaving home, and if you don't leave home until your mid-30s, it's quite a worrying development in one's life.
Right.
Yeah, it is.
So, well, the question is what can government policy do?
Yeah.
And I think, for example, this issue of housing, if it's hard and expensive and difficult to get past housing regulations to build housing because of these green belt laws, then you have less housing supply, and therefore housing is more expensive. If it's hard to hire and fire people because of tight labor market rules that discourage hiring, or taxes are too high.
It's not because of tight labour laws that this is happening.
No, but if
it's often because of poor wages that this is happening.
No, but so you want to get people into the labour market. So if you have a national minimum wage law that makes it uneconomic to hire people.
Okay. I'm going to dive in because we told people that we'd tell them what the most common password is, and we've only got about 10 seconds to tell us, so it won't take long. Tell us what the most common password people use is.
It's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6.
That's not complicated.
And the second one is password. Yeah. No wonder what the Russians are hacking us and the Chinese.
On that note, we must leave it. But Sohrab and Dr. Eliza Filby, thank you both very much indeed. Let's get the weather.